When people talk about going deeper into themselves, they imagine peace waiting at the bottom. But the truth is quieter and more unsettling. The deeper you go, the darker it often gets, not because something is wrong with you, but because you're finally entering the rooms you've avoided your whole life. The mind doesn't get darker. It just gets more honest. The top layer of the mind is designed for survival. It organizes what's acceptable, what keeps you functioning, what keeps the world predictable. It edits you so you can be liked, productive, and safe. That's why most people's lives are spent rearranging the visible, the routines, the goals, the self-images, while the invisible world underneath remains untouched. Going deeper means entering that invisible terrain, and the first thing you find there isn't peace. It's confusion, sadness, and memories that never finished speaking. People often mistake darkness for evil, but in the psyche, darkness simply means unseen. What's unseen begins to rot in silence. The feelings you pushed away decades ago are still waiting, stored like frozen time. They form shapes in your behavior. The hesitation when someone gets too close, the sudden irritation when you feel ignored, the way you plan your life around not feeling certain things. Every defensive habit has a buried tenderness beneath it, something you once had to protect. When you start to explore these layers, the first thing that breaks is certainty. You realize how many of your beliefs were built to avoid pain, not to discover truth. You see how much of your personality is actually armor. The you that everyone knows is the version that made sense in a certain environment, the one that earned love by performing stability. But the deeper self doesn't want performance. It wants integration. And integration always begins with disorder. If this feels familiar, stay with me, because there's nothing wrong with the darkness you find. It's proof that something inside you is still alive enough to feel. The human mind stores contradiction like sediment, layer after layer of unfinished emotion. Each layer represents a version of you that adapted to survive a specific moment in time. When life demanded silence, one layer learned to stay quiet. When life demanded strength, another learned to numb. The result is a mind made of many selves, each protecting the next. So when you descend inward, you're not just exploring thoughts, you're meeting your own ghosts. The reason it feels darker the deeper you go is because you're losing the light of social approval. Up here in daily life, we see ourselves through mirrors held by others. How we're perceived, accepted, admired. Down there, those mirrors disappear. You meet the parts of you that have never been seen. And that loss of visibility can feel like death. People often stop their inner work at that threshold. They mistake the discomfort for danger. But the danger isn't in seeing your pain. It's in never letting it be seen. Avoided emotions don't vanish. They turn into patterns. That's why people repeat the same relationships, the same emotional dynamics, the same self-sabotage. It's not a failure of willpower. It's the mind's attempt to finish an old story using new characters. The psyche has an old intelligence. It wants to heal, even when healing hurts. So it keeps bringing forward the same emotional themes until you turn toward them. That's why the deeper layers of your mind don't just hold darkness. They hold longing. The longing to be understood by you. Every time you suppress a part of yourself, you build an inner orphanage, rooms filled with the versions of you that weren't allowed to exist. The angry child, the ashamed teenager, the hopeful dreamer who is told to be realistic. When you descend inward, you begin hearing them again. Their voices echo as impulses, dreams, sudden tears for no reason. And listening to them can feel terrifying because they remind you how much you've abandoned to survive. We were taught that maturity means control, holding yourself together, keeping your emotions clean. But control is often just fear in disguise. The deeper self doesn't want to be controlled. It wants to be witnessed. Control silences. Witnessing transforms. When you finally allow the darker emotions to be seen, they begin to reorganize. They lose their edge. They become information instead of threat. People say they fear the dark side of the mind, but what they really fear is the loss of identity. Because once you see how much of your personality was defense, you can't unsee it. You can't keep pretending that your perfectionism is ambition, or that your people-pleasing is kindness. You start realizing how many of your strengths were born from pain. And that realization can collapse the image you've built. But that collapse is sacred. It's the psyche's version of winter, everything dying back to reveal the soil beneath. The darkness is not punishment. It's preparation. When you let old identities decay, new growth can finally root in truth. Still, it's hard to stay gentle while everything familiar dissolves. That's why the descent into the darker mind isn't a single act. It's a rhythm. You go down, you return, you breathe. Each time, you bring a little more light to what's been hidden. Each time, you find that the darkness isn't endless. It's layered, and beneath each layer is something softer, something waiting to be forgiven. Forgiveness in this sense doesn't mean excusing the past. It means recognizing that every reaction, every adaptation, once made sense. The self you're meeting in the dark isn't broken. It's outdated. It learned to protect you with the tools it had. The work now is not to erase it, but to thank it and move beyond its limits. That's why depth always begins with humility. Not the kind that bows, but the kind that admits, I don't fully know myself yet. That admission opens a door the intellect can't. It lets you see your mind not as a machine to fix, but as a living organism, one that has been trying to heal you through every symptom, every fear, every repeating pattern. The deeper you go, the less the mind feels like an enemy. You begin to realize it's been carrying the weight of everything you couldn't process consciously. Anxiety becomes communication. Depression becomes protest. The darkness begins to make sense. It's the language of what's been neglected. And as you keep descending, something unexpected happens. The darkness starts to change texture. It's no longer heavy, but dense with meaning. You sense that behind it lies not destruction, but depth itself, the very place where real freedom begins. But freedom has a cost, and it starts with what happens when you stop running from the part of you that feels unlovable. When you stop running from the part of you that feels unlovable, you enter the most difficult terrain of all, the space between pain and tenderness. This is the layer of the mind where the darkness stops being about memory and starts being about meaning. Up until now, the shadows have shown you where you were hurt. But here, they begin to show you who you became because of that hurt. The unlovable self isn't a single part. It's a collection of moments when love was withdrawn at the exact time you needed it most. Those moments fuse together into a silent identity, a subconscious belief that says, if I show this part of me, I'll lose connection. The mind keeps that belief hidden, not out of cruelty, but out of loyalty. It protects the child who once needed to disappear to survive. But every protection eventually becomes a prison. This is why people fear intimacy, even while craving it. Love threatens the self-protections that once kept them alive. When someone truly sees you, the old defenses panic. You feel exposed, not because the other person is unsafe, but because love is touching the wound that once learned to live without it. That's why the mind grows darker here. It's trying to reconcile two truths that feel impossible. I want to be seen, and I'm terrified of being seen. In that tension, the mind starts creating illusions, subtle stories meant to keep the balance intact. You tell yourself you're too complicated to be understood, or that people always leave, or that it's safer to stay independent. But beneath those stories lies a deeper truth. You are still negotiating with the memory of absence. Every time you pull away from love, you're protecting yourself from a ghost, not a person. To go deeper, you must see how the darkness moves through you. It doesn't just live in thoughts, it colors perception. When you expect rejection, you start noticing only signs that confirm it. When you expect betrayal, every silence feels like proof. The unconscious mind filters reality through old pain, not to deceive you, but to prepare you, to make sure you never feel blindsided again. But that preparation comes at a cost. It keeps you living in a world that no longer exists. People often think healing is about light, about positive thinking, forgiveness, release. But the real transformation happens when you sit long enough in the dark to see its patterns clearly. Darkness has structure. It's the architecture of your unmet needs. When you begin to trace those lines, when you see how your behaviors form a map of your forgotten emotions, something begins to loosen. You stop identifying with the darkness and start listening to it. This is where emotional maturity is born, not from perfection, but from compassion for your own contradictions. You start realizing that the parts of you that sabotage, that isolate, that rage, are not villains. They're translators. They're trying to express needs that you've never felt safe enough to name. Every outburst, every withdrawal, every obsessive thought is the mind's language for I'm still hurting, but I don't know how to say it safely. The mind grows darker the deeper you go, because the pain closer to the core is more innocent. It's not about ego or pride. It's about love that was interrupted. The child inside you wasn't asking for validation or achievement. It was asking to be held. And when that didn't happen, the psyche learned to hold itself through control, through performance, through intellect. But control is a poor substitute for comfort. So when you finally reach this layer, everything that once gave you stability starts to shake. Your goals, your image, your relationships, they all feel different, as if seen through new eyes. That's because they were built partly to cover the original wound. When that wound begins to heal, the structures built around it lose their purpose. It's disorienting, even frightening, to realize that the life you've built was never truly yours. It was your defense's version of safety. But that disorientation is sacred. It means your psyche is reorienting toward truth instead of protection. You begin to notice that some friendships existed only to keep you busy. Some ambitions were fueled by the need to prove worth. Some desires were echoes of old pain dressed up as purpose. Seeing this isn't failure. It's clarity. It's the moment your mind stops living reactively and begins living consciously. Still, clarity doesn't erase grief. You mourn the years you spent running from yourself, the people you lost because you couldn't yet stay open, the opportunities missed while trying to look strong. That grief is part of the descent. It's the release of stored time. Each tear is the psyche returning a piece of energy that's been held hostage by the past. You start to feel lighter, but the lightness isn't happiness. It's honesty. Honesty is heavier than people expect. It doesn't always bring relief. Sometimes it brings a sobering calm, the kind that comes when illusion finally dissolves. You begin to understand that healing isn't the opposite of darkness. It's the ability to hold darkness without turning away. The more you can stay present with what once terrified you, the more the mind begins to trust itself again. Trust, after all, is the nervous system's first language of safety. And then, something unexpected happens. Beneath all the pain and fear, you start to feel warmth. Not excitement or joy, something quieter, like recognition. It's the moment your inner world starts to realize that nothing inside you is truly unlovable. The parts you thought were too messy or too broken were simply never met with understanding. When you meet them now without judgment, the whole architecture of shame begins to crumble. Shame survives only in silence. Once you speak its truth, once you name the need beneath it, it can no longer hide. That's why going deep feels dark at first, because shame resists light. It tells you you're the only one, that no one could understand, that this feeling makes you unworthy. But when you start to see shame as evidence of unacknowledged tenderness, not proof of defect, it loses power. You realize the darkness isn't trying to destroy you. It's trying to show you where you stopped believing you were good. The deeper you go, the closer you get to that belief. The one that says, I am allowed to exist as I am. That belief isn't built. It's remembered. It was always there, hidden beneath the adaptations. The journey through darkness is how you uncover it. But before that remembering can become real, the psyche tests you one last time. It asks, can you love what you once feared most? Can you stand in front of your own shadow and not demand it to change? Because that, not light, not positivity, is where real wholeness begins. Wholeness doesn't begin in light. It begins in the place where you stop trying to escape yourself. When you stand before your own shadow and choose to stay, something ancient happens. The war inside you ends. Not because you've won, but because you've stopped fighting a battle that was never meant to be fought. For most of your life, you've been divided. The part that wants to grow and the part that wants to hide. Growth pulls you forward. Darkness pulls you back. You've mistaken the pullback for sabotage, but it's actually protection. The part of you that resists change is the same part that once saved you. It still believes safety means invisibility. That's why every time you approach real transformation, fear rises. The mind is asking, will I survive being seen this deeply? When you start answering that question, not with force, but with presence, the darkness begins to change. You realize that the shadow was never a threat. It was a memory of love withheld. The pain wasn't punishment. It was longing without language. Every fear you've carried has roots in that silent longing. To be accepted, to be allowed, to exist without performance. The deeper you go, the more you see that every emotion you've judged has always been trying to guide you home. Most people think self-understanding means gaining control over their emotions. But the real gift of depth is surrender. Not passive surrender, sacred surrender, the kind that says, I no longer need to protect myself from my own experience. When you stop dividing feelings into good and bad, you begin to see that all emotion is communication. Anger speaks of violated boundaries. Sadness speaks of lost connection. Anxiety speaks of uncertainty. You weren't taught to tolerate. When you listen, the darkness stops being dark. It becomes a teacher, fluent in your forgotten language. This is why people who do deep inner work often become softer, not stronger in the traditional sense. They stop striving for invulnerability and start valuing sensitivity. They realize that sensitivity isn't weakness, it's precision. It's the nervous system's way of saying, I'm alive enough to notice. The deeper you go, the more you understand that numbness was never peace. It was just the absence of permission to feel. And yet emerging from the darkness isn't about staying in perpetual introspection. It's about bringing what you've learned back into life. The real measure of inner depth is not how much you've seen, but how gently you now move through the world. People who have faced their darkness tend to look at others differently. Judgment softens. You start to see pain behind behavior, fear beneath control, love underneath anger. The world becomes more human, less divided into right and wrong, good and evil. You stop needing to categorize everything because you've seen enough inside yourself to know that contradiction is natural. This awareness changes how you relate. You start speaking slower, not because you're unsure, but because you're finally aware of how powerful words can be. You notice when others speak from fear, and instead of reacting, you listen for what they're protecting. You stop taking rejection personally. You can sense when someone's avoidance isn't about you, but about their own unhealed story. That sensitivity once made you feel weak. Now it makes you wise. The darkness teaches you empathy, not the polite kind, but the visceral kind. The kind that comes from knowing what it feels like to be misunderstood, to be afraid of your own depth. Once you've sat with your own pain long enough, you can sit with someone else's without needing to fix it. You realize that presence is more healing than advice. Silence can hold more love than reassurance. The world doesn't need more perfection. It needs more presence. Still, the journey doesn't end in light. It never really ends at all. The psyche continues to move in cycles, contraction and expansion, descent and return. Every time you think you've reached the bottom, another layer invites you deeper. But this time, the darkness no longer feels like falling. It feels like belonging. You begin to understand that your depths aren't a flaw. They are the terrain of your humanity. Sometimes, after deep inner work, you'll feel empty. That emptiness is sacred, too. It's the space left behind when defense mechanisms dissolve. The mind doesn't yet know how to live without the noise, so it feels like loss. But it's not loss. it's readiness. You're clearing room for authenticity, and authenticity always begins as quiet. In that quiet, a strange peace begins to grow. It's not joy, not relief, something older. A kind of knowing that says, I can handle my own truth. The darkness is no longer a place you fall into. It's a home you return to when the surface becomes too loud. You begin to see that the mind's depth isn't a descent at all. It's an expansion inward. The further you go, the more you realize how much light the dark was hiding. There's a moment, subtle but unmistakable, when you stop being afraid of yourself. You feel it when shame dissolves, mid-thought, when self-criticism gives way to understanding, when an old trigger no longer pulls you under. It's not that the wound disappears. It's that you've learned to hold it without flinching, and that holding changes everything. You start to notice beauty in places you once overlooked. The quiet of an empty room, the honesty in a stranger's eyes, the small kindnesses that no one will ever see. Darkness sharpens perception. It makes you aware of subtle light. You understand that people are not good or bad, healed or broken. They're just at different depths of self-acceptance. Some are still on the surface, afraid of what they might find below. Others are still falling, but all are searching for the same thing, a way to feel whole while still being human. And maybe that's what Jung was really pointing toward, not the fear of darkness, but its necessity. The mind must descend to integrate what the surface life cannot hold. The shadow isn't the enemy of light. It's its foundation. Without knowing you're dark, your light stays fragile, performative, easily threatened. But when you've walked through your own inner night, your light becomes steady. It's no longer about brightness. It's about depth. The deeper you go, the less you chase happiness, and the more you crave truth. Truth isn't always comfortable, but it's clean. It asks nothing but presence. It doesn't demand you to be perfect, only real. And in that realness, the distinction between dark and light starts to blur. You begin to sense that they are not opposites, but partners, each giving the other meaning. So yes, the human mind gets darker the deeper you go, but that darkness is not the end of the story. It's the soil of awareness, rich, alive, and waiting. Every shadow is a seed of potential that grows only when it's no longer shamed. Every fear, when met with understanding, becomes wisdom. And every piece of you that once hid in the dark eventually turns toward the light on its own. Maybe that's what it means to evolve, not to escape your darkness, but to become spacious enough to hold it, to see that your depths are not a danger, but a doorway. And somewhere in that quiet depth, the question remains, not how do I stay in the light, but how gently can I walk through the dark and still call it home?